Hey alumni, welcome to InterVarsity World Changers, the podcast celebrating God's world-changing work in and through InterVarsity alumni like you. I'm your host, John Steele, and today we're talking with Harvard alumnus Curtis Chang, and Curtis is changing the world through Redeeming Babel, an organization he founded to equip Christians to navigate the divisions and confusion of our culture and make sense of their role in the world's institutions. Thanks for tuning in, and enjoy Curtis's story. Curtis, welcome to InterVarsity World Changers.
It's great to be here, John. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So glad that we get to jump on this call together, talk a little bit about how you are partnering with the Lord and His world-changing work in your context and abroad, and excited to hear at least a portion of your story and the work that you're doing with Jesus. But before we jump in too far, would you take a moment, Curtis, just to introduce yourself for us? Who are you? Help me and help our audience get to know you a little bit.
Yes, my name is Curtis Chang, and I've had multiple careers in my life, so I'll just try to describe them very briefly, and then we can take the conversation wherever is interesting. So after college, I was joined InterVarsity staff. I was on staff at Harvard, Tufts, MIT, and was the area director ultimately for the Boston area back in the late 90s. Then I became a pastor of a church, Evangelical Covenant Church, out in the Bay Area here. And then after that, I started a consulting firm that serves secular nonprofits and government agencies, and have done that. And I still run that firm. So a big part of what I'm doing currently is leading an organization called Redeeming Babel, which produces content that helps Christians make sense of the world, especially the world of institutions and institutional realities like politics and organizations. So I'm doing that while also running my consulting firm. So I'd like to maybe summarize it by saying I tend to think I've had three careers. I've had one in ministry, a second one as running my own consulting firm, and a third one where I'm trying to merge those two in a way that I hope I'm hearing correctly, God inviting me to do so.
Yeah, that is fascinating, and I'm excited. We're going to spend time, I think, digging in particular into Redeeming Babel and sort of this third career that you're spending time in right now. But first, let's jump back and spend a little more time in the sort of introductory days with InterVarsity. You said you were on staff. Were you a student with InterVarsity before coming on staff?
I was also a student at Harvard and was the exec president. I was the president of the student chapter before going on volunteer staff and then full-time staff.
Did you cross paths with Tom Lin being at Harvard at that time?
I did. Actually, I helped lead the effort to plant the Asian American Fellowship, and Tom was the first staff worker for the Asian American Fellowship. Like technically, he was on my team when he started his work in InterVarsity. So I like to think that I taught him everything he knows.
I'm sure that's how he thinks of it as well.
I'm just kidding, Tom, if you're listening.
That's amazing. Well, I mean, that sounds like some standout moments in and of themselves. But as you think back over this history that you've had with InterVarsity, are there any particular moments that stand out to you as just like, oh boy, here's sort of a quintessential, this is a moment that really just summarizes what my experience was like?
I don't think I can pick one. There were so many, but I would say some of them would involve, at least in our area, the classic formational experience of going through Mark study over a whole year and then leading others, in multiple rounds over the years of people in Mark study, going to chapter camp and just very, late night conversations with friends. And I would say mostly it's the friendships that really feel to me like they really last, the ways in which God used, deep friendships to form each other as followers of Jesus. And they have both been a source of, quite honestly, of great joy in how they've been sustained. And also I would actually just be honest to say, also profound sadness and disappointment at some of where those friendships have gone. So both are present realities.
Yes. Those are all things that come up very frequently in the many conversations with alumni that I've had over the last few years. And that's things like community, the friendships that you make. And it is amazing to me how often studying the book of Mark comes up as one of the things that just stands out to people. It is amazing that one book has had so much impact on so many alumni. That is amazing. And just like many alumni remember the book of Mark very dearly, all alumni remember hearing time and time and time again the vision of InterVarsity, of lives transformed, campuses renewed, world changers developed. And it's that third part of that vision statement that we're really leaning into with this podcast. And what does it mean to be a world changer? And what does it mean to be an InterVarsity world changer in particular? And we would say that's somebody that has had formative experience with InterVarsity in one way or another, and who continues to grow in those four loves: love for God, love for His Word, for His people of every ethnicity and culture, and His purposes in the world. And you've already touched on this a little bit, and in far more ways than just the ones that you've mentioned. But we're going to lean into Redeeming Babel and the ways that you have been partnering with Jesus. You say, like, you feel fairly confident. You've been hearing from the Lord that this is the direction that He's leading you. And so I'd love to hear a little bit more. Can you tell us, you've already started to explain it a bit, but tell us a bit more. What is Redeeming Babel?
Well, I think I can tell about it by doing a retrospective of my first two career arcs. So I very much was formed and shaped and believed very strongly in the value of my work in ministry, both with InterVarsity and as a church. And I would say, though, the part of it that felt always like something was slightly missing was that, the vision of InterVarsity and really of the church is preparing people to go out into the world, to precisely the theme of this podcast, and to bear witness to Jesus in ways that ultimately change others, hopefully change parts of the world, but ultimately are just about faithfulness to bearing witness. And that was why I really went on staff, was with the vision of equipping students to go into the world, because you're not building a permanent fellowship. Every 4 years, your entire fellowship is, turns over, and you only have people for most of your students. You only have them for 4 years at tops, if sometimes quite less. So your vision of the change you want to see is going to pay off as they go into the world. And that was similarly when I became a pastor. I became a pastor of a church in Silicon Valley at the .com boom, with the idea that in the same way that InterVarsity put me into contact with people who were about to go into the world in some very important parts of the world and in influential positions and leadership and so forth like that, that the church in Silicon Valley at that time was sending people out on, from Monday to Saturday, or Monday to Friday. Sometimes I'm sure they probably worked on Saturdays as well, to work at some very influential institutions like Apple and Intel and Microsoft and Google and so forth. But I felt like, because I went into ministry essentially right away, both in InterVarsity and on the church, I never really experienced life in secular institutions myself. And there was always this nagging sense that I had that I was preparing people to go out into a world that I actually did not know that much about, that I only knew about in theory. But I had never really experienced life in a secular institution. And that was a big reason why, for that second career arc of starting this consulting firm, was I felt like I was just tired of teaching, preaching, discipling people to live life faithfully in a world that I just didn't really have great deep insight about. I remember when I was preaching, my theology of the kingdom, shaped to a large extent by my experience in InterVarsity, is that the gifts that God has given us, the talents, the skills, and so forth that God's given us, are meant for the world. They are not just meant to be kept to serve the fellowship, in the case of the InterVarsity, or just the church, but they're meant to go out into the world. And yet I remember trying to prepare sermons on this, to preach this theology, that I would get to the point of the sermon where you're supposed to be like the call to action, the invitation to go, therefore go do this. And realizing that as a pastor, that I actually had very little to say in terms of a concrete opportunity to say, therefore, this is what it means. That all the opportunities for action were really actually all about serving the church, because we need more people, youth volunteers. We need, people doing this. Or even if it was a world-facing thing, it was something that we were doing. It was like our soup kitchen or our homeless shelter or whatever. It wasn't actually something that was firmly ensconced in the world, birthed in the world, and so forth. And I just got tired of that. So that was what led me to that second career arc of starting a consulting firm that really was actually, the business model of the consulting firm was equipping people of faith who were financially sort of provided for from working at Google or Apple or so forth, but to actually use those skills as in marketing, in strategic planning or technology and so forth, but to use those skills to serve secular nonprofits who were serving the least of these in our community. And so that was my firm. It's called Consulting Within Reach. So that's a long story to say. I've had this arc of serving the church, serving the institutions. And what Redeeming Babel comes in is about 6 years ago, I had this realization that my ministry increasingly in running this consulting firm was serving this being called a secular institution, a nonprofit, a hospital, after school club, and so forth. But that I didn't actually have a very strong theology of what an institution is in God's kingdom, like especially a secular institution. And so I started that started a theological journey for me of saying, what is the theology of institutions, especially secular institutions? And that really was the impetus for forming Redeeming Babel and beginning to realize, oh, that's been a missing piece in my ministry, both in InterVarsity and as a pastor, was I never really had a story to tell, a theological story to tell my students or my parishioners about their life in the secular organization. And specifically, what was it? What was this thing, this being called Google or Apple or Boys and Girls Club or something like that? And so it increasingly became apparent that Christians more broadly didn't have that story, and therefore was, I think, in some ways not well equipped to make sense of the world, because the world is shaped by institutions, especially secular institutions. And our lives as Christians are often very much defined by our lives serving these institutions. And yet we don't really have a good way, a language, a story to tell about these institutions. And so that Redeeming Babel was formed to provide that story, to help Christians make sense of their life in the world, especially the world's institutions.
Yes, making sense of the world's institutions. And it's interesting, you talk about that all of this great background that you had in ministry, being discipled by InterVarsity, being a part of discipling others with InterVarsity, this pastoral ministry as well that you were doing, and wanting to invite people to step into the world and to engage the world well as Jesus would and as he invites them to, but to say, I don't actually have a context for how to do this well, and that urged you on and sort of stepping in and testing out and experiencing yourself to be able to develop a strong theology of what it looks like to carry these things together and to disciple other people into it. And so I'm interested to know, I didn't write this question specifically for you to be considering, but I mean, really, what is sort of the beginning of this theology around these entities that live in the world that don't necessarily serve the kingdom? Like, what is the introduction to engaging well with those?
Yeah, well, I think I would say that these are actually a key part is to think of them as beings, to think of organizations not as things or not things as tools, but to think of them as beings, because that's what they are. They're human beings in the collective. That's what an organization is. It's human beings joined together in common cause. And so that in their own way, because organizations are fundamentally human beings, not in the same way that an individual human being is a human being, but not also in a completely disconnected way either. They're still human. They're just human in the collective sense. That in their own way, human organizations also bear the image of God, right? We are used to thinking of image bearing primarily in the individual, right? So when I was an InterVarsity staff, what motivated me to get up on Monday morning or Friday morning for whatever, prayer or youth group, for large group or whatever, was because I believe these individual students were made in the image of God and therefore had infinite worth, dignity, value, a purpose, a place in God's story. What got me out of bed on Sunday morning as a pastor was I believed in the collective, this being called the church also bore the image of God, was the body of Christ, right? Fallen, imperfect, but nevertheless destined to be redeemed to be the pure bride of Christ. Again, another imaging of God, right? And so we generally think of imaging, the bearing the image of God in individual terms. We will make a special case for a collective imaging of God for the church. But actually, the scripture is quite clear that all human beings, not just Christians, not just the people of God bear the image of God, all human beings do. So similarly, all human organizations in their own way also have the capacity to image the character and nature of God. And so that's really the big fundamental shift, is to see that the organizations we work for are not just things. They're not just tools, inanimate tools, but they're actually beings that in their own way bear the image of God. And because they bear the image of God, they participate in the grand story of God, which is all about repairing broken, deformed images in the world. Again, we're used to thinking about that as individuals. And what I'm trying to expand Christian imagination is to say that that same repair and redemption of flawed images applies not just to individuals, but also to humans in the collective, in the organizations as well.
Yeah, sort of a reprogramming that's required because it is easy to think of something like Google as a bunch of computers that are at work in the background behind what I'm doing on my computer, or a big building, and that has Google stamped on the front of it, but that it is a collection of people, and that is such a fascinating reframing of these organizations, that they are beings, that they are collections of image bearers, just like you and me. And if we think about the church that way, why wouldn't we think about these other collections of people that way, as image bearers, and what it looks like to influence and be influenced by these image bearers, and to do a work of redeeming in those places? That is a fascinating reframe. And so as I've spent a little bit of time exploring Redeeming Babel, it looks like there's like 3 touch points that you do this through. And I think I'm correct that you use the frames of the interior, the institutional, and the societal. Can you just sort of break down those things, and how is it that people are engaging with Redeeming Babel and beyond through Redeeming Babel with those 3 things?
Yeah, so you think of this as 3 levels, right? The interior being the interior of the individual, the institution being the part of the organizational life that we live with others, and then the societal as we're part of a larger, society, and what happens there as these 3 levels. Redeeming Babel really started at that middle level, right? Because it started with my passion around this theology of institutions and wanting to help Christians think more biblically about their organizational lives. So that's kind of the middle level, is institutional. But as we pushed more into that, we realized it was hard for Christians to really make a full grasp of their organizational lives if we didn't also branch out into touch points at the interior, and also telescoping broadly at the societal level. And so at the interior level, we have a real content stream on anxiety, because it turns out that you can't really make sense of organizations if you can't also have some way of making sense of anxiety, because organizations actually are a place where we experience a lot of anxiety. Also, organizations themselves can be anxious beings themselves, that in fact a lot of their fallenness comes out of ways in which they mishandle their anxiety, as it turns out. And I think also a big part of that stream was also just because I myself am somebody that have struggled with anxiety for a long time. And I've come to realize that Christian approaches to anxiety are, just like their approach to organizations, are also in many ways flawed and wrongly constructed, that we have often been taught of anxiety as a sign of lack of faith, or something that you pray away. Or if we don't stigmatize it as something that we just is still a problem, it's just a problem we outsource to secular mental health. And so a lot of our content on anxiety is helping Christians reframe anxiety not as a problem, either to pray away or to outsource away to secular mental health, but actually as a spiritual opportunity for growth. So so I have a book out called The Anxiety Opportunity. We have a course on the Redeeming Babel website that helps individuals and small groups go through anxiety. We have similarly a course for that on institutional life, on the theology of institutions. But my real emphasis this year is on this broad social level, which is about politics. It's helping to move Christians towards a better Christian politics amidst, in a cultural, social movement, when Christians, especially American evangelicals, have been so prone to a hijacking of partisan forces that has really brought a great deal of harm and division within the church, and also within the broader society as well. Yeah. And so that's at this third level, the high societal level, It's a project called the After Party. And so the After Party is a project that David French, Russell Moore, and myself have led that is trying to help reframe Christian understanding and approaches to politics. We do have a course that's already available, and people can check it out at after-party.org. I'll have a book on that title coming out in April, and this is going to be a big theme for us in 2024 for obvious reasons.
Wow. Curtis, as you across these three different spaces, is there like a common invitation that people are being given in these spaces of the way to engage with the interior, the institutional, and the societal? Is there a common invitation there?
Yes, I think the common invitation is that that God's story makes sense of our experiences, whether it's anxiety, our organizational lives, or our politics, in surprising and profound ways. That the story of God, the Bible, the biblical meta narrative, if you will, is far richer, far more complex, and also far more surprising than what most of us have been taught. Even those of us who've gone through the riches of being in university that have not been taught all of these things. And so we kind of feel like there's this surprising relevance of the gospel that is really important for Christians to embrace in this day and age when we are so prone to anxiety at the individual level, when we're so prone to institutional distrust or rejection at that organizational level, or to polarization and division at that broad political, social level.
Yeah, it sounds to me like part of that invitation is this idea or this reframing that like Jesus is here in each of these spaces. I mean, you talk about something like the anxiety opportunity, and that it makes it sound like that each of these three places and beyond, sometimes it feels like we are prone to say like, man, Jesus' place is really broken and messed up, and I wish that you would just get in here and change it, and like, could you please just come into this place? And almost this reframing of like, Jesus is already there, and his plan includes working through these things and even using them, like not just saying like, well, let's pray it away, like you said, not that, but saying like, where is the opportunity that's in the midst of this, and how is Jesus already at work?
Yes, I think that's a great way to summarize that, John. In our anxiety, that Jesus is inviting us to go, not just to make it go away as a problem, but to actually enter it, experience it with him. In our organizations, it's not a thing that we just have to do to make a living, then we go live our real lives in after work or on the weekends, but that in your organizational life itself is Jesus at work with a calling for a higher purpose in your life to participate in his grand work of redeeming these images, these flawed images called human organizations. And then similarly in our politics, where we're so prone to just wanting to check out because it looks so bad, looks so broken, we are exhausted and we've given up, we've been burned, or we've seen, our family or our friends go down weird places with it that we want to just like check out, is to say, no, let's actually lean in because there is actually a better story about politics that ultimately has a hopeful ending. And by the way, that's why we call it the After Party, is because both it is calling Christians to place their hope in politics in something that transcends, that is beyond or after the political parties of the left or the right, Democrat or Republican, and to place it ultimately in the Jesus After Party, which is the wedding feast of the Lamb. It's the party to come that we are promised when Jesus returns to this world, doesn't take us out of this world, returns to this world, where heaven comes to earth, the kingdom comes into the earthly realms and transforms and redeems it.
Yes, the kingdom that will transcend and outlast any other party or affiliation or kingdom that exists here, and what does it look like for us to reframe the way that we engage based on a kingdom that will last forever? And wow, that's so. I mean, Curtis, as you engage with all of these things, I imagine that this is an invitation from Jesus for you to step into these places, and I imagine that it hasn't been easy from beginning to end. But I mean, as you engage around these topics with people with Redeeming Babel and through Redeeming Babel, like, are there challenges that you've come across in engaging with this world-changing work with Jesus?
Oh, yes. I mean, I think this, even currently right now, as we lean into the political sphere, you can't lean meaningfully into the political environment today without multiple people getting very mad at you, and being angry at you for one reason or another. So for sure, there's and everything you do, there's going to be resistance and pushback that you have to actually go through as well with Jesus. And so we're certainly experiencing this right now with criticism from the far right that's accusing us of all sorts of things that are completely false. And so, but even there is ultimately, as painful as that is an opportunity, right? Like, for instance, these days I am finding so much more relevant the book of Psalms. The book of Psalms, if you read it, are so full of these sort of like, I have enemies on the left, enemies on the right. The so-and-so betrayed me, God, and imprecatory Psalms that are like, God, may you have my enemies fall into their own traps. And when you're like living just a life that is not engaged on the front lines of something that involves contention and enemies, opponents, those Psalms seem bizarre. Like, for much of my life, I was just like, you just skip over them. Like, okay, whatever. But they've come so much more life to me, because I've, experienced betrayal. I've experienced enemies speaking lies about me. I've experienced feeling like the traps have been set for me. And so I pray those Psalms in a way like, oh, they're real. They are the Psalms of people who God has called, like David has called into a moment in space, in time, in history, of which there is contention and enemies and, conflict, and how to navigate that. Suddenly it makes those parts of Scripture come alive.
Yeah, take that one step further for me. Like you're leaning into these Psalms and the way that they've transformed for you and become much more meaningful. Like, how is even your engagement with Jesus changing? Like, what does that partnership with him look like as you step further in and see, like, yeah, you're confirming for me that this is where you're bringing me. You did indeed call me here, and these are the roadblocks that I'm coming up against. Even as you experience those things, like, what does that do for you in your relationship with Jesus?
I think just like the Psalms become much more real, Jesus becomes much more real when you are following him into the places of the world in which there is real brokenness. So for instance, as you push into organizational life, you realize that organizations are fallen beings, and they're fallen not just in the abstract, but they are fallen in ways that actually damage people in real ways. Organizations can betray their people, and that is a painful process when you have committed yourself to give yourself to serve, to trust an institution. I think this is especially true with churches, or Christian organizations that you entrust yourself to.
Yeah.
And they betray you in one way or another. For whatever, they allow abuse to happen, and they cover up the abuse, which has been a persistent, prevalent problem that's been being exposed in the Christian world these days. That's a deep, profound betrayal. What do you do with that? What do you do with the sense that leaders, people you knew and trusted, betrayed you? Well, for me, one of the things I'm realizing, this makes sense why Jesus had to be betrayed. Like, before it's like, well, why that? That's a weird twist. Like, why did Jesus have to undergo betrayal certainly by Judas, but also by all the institutions that did not recognize him, that ultimately crucified him, even by his closest friends, in terms of ways that they couldn't kind of do what he was asking them to do and expecting them to do, right? Falling asleep in Gethsemane. And so I've just come to like, I understand. And I understand Jesus, and Jesus understands me as the betrayed one. And I think if you live lives that are pressing into institutions, you will experience betrayal, and you will understand more. Oh, this is why Jesus had to experience betrayal, because he was taking on the fullness of human experience. And the fullness of human experience includes institutional betrayal, right? Jesus was betrayed by the temple, by the Pharisees, by the Sadducees, by the Roman Empire, by all these institutions. Jesus experienced betrayal. And that makes sense why the story, like, it's very interesting, just as a side tangent, right? I've never quite realized this until this sort of institutional piece and came in thinking. But if I were to ask you the question, John, who crucified Jesus? Like, how would you answer that question?
Oh gosh, that's a layered question.
Well, it's a layered question because the answer is there is no who. There is no arch villain that is the individual that is responsible, which tells you something about the nature of reality, the nature of human reality. That when Jesus experienced human sin at its sharpest, most profound point, he did not experience it as the act of one individual. He experienced it as a constellation of institutions not doing what they're supposed to do, covering up things that they wanted to cover up, acting for wrong incentives. Ultimately, or what made it summer is they betrayed their true calling as institutions, right? So that in itself should tell you something about who Jesus is and the scope of his reach into the world, that it was not just to take on the sin of individuals. It was that. I'm not saying it wasn't that, but it was more than that. You can't understand the cross and the story of the cross if you don't understand it as a story of institutional betrayal. And so that tells us something about then when we follow Jesus and we pick up our own cross into the world, what we should expect might happen to us, that we should expect we are going to experience our own version of institutional betrayal.
Which honestly makes the work that you're doing that much more fascinating to me because of what we talked about before, of you're encouraging people to look at these institutions, to look at these organizations as a being, as beings, and to lean even further into this isn't just some nameless company that is sort of behind the scenes doing these things to that. This like there are people here. What does it look like to engage with people?
That's right. Or these are just kind of a purely consumer transactional experience where it's like, okay, I'll give you 45 hours or 50 hours of my life. You'll give me X number of dollars and that's it. And then saying, no, actually, organizations are places for us to live out our participation in the redemptive work of Jesus in the world, not just a place to get a paycheck.
Yes. Which I love because, I mean, so many of the people listening to this podcast right now are maybe driving to work or driving home from work, or one organization or another, one institution or another that they are about to participate in or have just participated in, and to say, like, what does it look like for us to change the way that we think about this, not just as this purely transactional, it has no impact, but like there's discipling work that's being done and that needs to be done in this space, and what does it look like for us to engage well with that very thoughtfully on a individual level, on a institutional level, and on a societal level? How do we have this helpful back and forth? And I think it's amazing that you and the rest of the people working with Redeeming Babel are speaking into those kinds of things.
Right. And by the way, just very practically, John, if anybody is listening and are intrigued, like, boy, what exactly is this theology of organizations, and how could it change my approach to my work or my school or this neighborhood association that I'm a part of? We have a course called God's Purpose for Your Organizational Life that really lays out. It's a video-based course, just like all our other courses are. Go to redeemingbabel.org. That's redeemingbabel.org, one word, and check out that course, God's Purpose for Your Organizational Life.
I love that. Curtis, are there like next steps that you're anticipating this? You said that you have a book that's coming out soon. Like this next year, you're really leaning into the after party and that side of things. Like, can you tell us just a little bit more about what are some of the next steps?
The course, the video course, theafterparty.org, which is really in some ways the backbone of our after party project, that's already out. So you can, like I said, after-party.org, you can take that course yourself. If people still don't understand exactly what it is, I think I imagine a lot of your listeners are in churches and they probably are familiar with Alpha, like the Alpha course for evangelism, right? So just here's my elevator pitch for the after party. What Alpha did for evangelism, right? The after party wants to do for politics. So think what Alpha does for evangelism as a trusted resource that you can just plug and play and go through it with some friends and kind of learn more about Jesus. The after party is trying to do that for politics, for a Christian formation around politics. Then we have a book coming out that I've co-wrote with Nancy French in April. And then the thing that I'm really excited about is that coming out at the same time, we are partnering with a Christian songwriting collaborative called Porter's Gate.
Oh, yeah.
And we are producing an album called Songs for the After Party. And it's a set of Christian worship songs on a healthy Christian approach to politics that's along the lines of the after party vision. Because right now, if you were a pastor and you in 2024 want to have a service, let's say, that's about, hey, let's try to counter the toxic polarization. Let's try to have a picture. Let's do a service about a healthier approach to politics. You're left with as a former senior pastor, I realized you're left with a conundrum, which is, what's your worship set sound like? Like, we don't actually have worship songs that are about a healthy approach to Christian politics. I don't think Onward Christian Soldiers quite qualifies as that.
Yeah, maybe the wrong message.
Maybe the wrong message. And so we partnered with this great collaborative called the Supporters Great, and with some leading Christian musicians and artists. And that album will be out around the same time in April as well. So we're hoping to all of that to present some resources to actually train, equip, and inspire Christians to have an approach to politics other than the current toxic partisan hostility.
Yeah. Curtis, as you think about your engagement with InterVarsity, past, present, future, look back with me for a moment again, and then also to the present here. Can you look back on this history that you have with InterVarsity up to this point and say, like, here's some of the moments, here's some of the formative threads that I can look at that have been super important for helping develop me into this direction, in this direction of the work that I'm doing here. And then also, as you think about your fellow alumni, do you have a word of advice that you would give to others who are trying to figure out, what does it look like for me to keep partnering with Jesus in my everyday context? So formative threads and word of advice for your fellow alumni.
Well, I do have a thought. I'm not sure it's exactly the answer to the question that you're asking, but I'll offer it, and maybe it connects. I think when I talk about the work that I'm doing now and the threads of, at the interior level around anxiety, at the organizational level about theology of institutions, at the societal level about politics, one thread that we talked about was this thread that Jesus is there. Jesus is there in anxiety, there in organizations, there in politics as well. There's another thread that runs through all of them in a negative sense, which is the reason why we have problems on all three of those levels, is that the church has, I would say, broadly speaking, failed to form our people in Jesus. We failed to form our people deeply in Jesus, such that at each of those deep levels of interior, institutional, and political, we are following and being shaped by Jesus more than we are by the culture, by ourselves, by the world, And so while I do think we have these problems at these three levels, we have a deeper problem, which is that I don't think fundamentally the church is doing a faithful job of forming our people. And I say that as a former pastor of a local church, that I'm keenly aware that my own leadership of my church, I think, fell far short of deep formation of our people in the kind of life-changing, world-changing way. I think this is where the vision of InterVarsity offers a clue for what needs to happen. I think the power of InterVarsity is in that where it's had the most lasting impact was in this deep formation that was formed in community around a set of commitments to Jesus that was lived out together in community with a kind of a radical call to discipleship. Put differently, I think InterVarsity was, if you were to step back in church history and say, what was InterVarsity? I would say it was kind of like the Protestant evangelical closest thing we had, or one of its closest we had to a monastic movement. I think that's the more deep you got into InterVarsity as a leader, a student leader, and then maybe even on staff or something like that, it essentially functioned like a monastic movement. Like you renounced certain things, sometimes unhealthily, but fundamentally there was like something good about that as well. You were joined together with other people to follow Jesus deeply and radically. And partly why so many InterVarsity alumni look back with fondness, but with a certain sense of nostalgia and whimsicalness, or not whimsical is the wrong word, nostalgia or longing, maybe is a better word for it, to the InterVarsity experience, is because it was so transformational as a monastic experience, but it was short, it was brief. And then for the rest of their lives, they've not quite had anything like that because the church has failed to provide that kind of deep formational experience. And I think one of the great challenges for Christians today, for leaders in the church, for just any regular person, is to figure out how do we recapture, not by replicating an experience you had in college in its identical form, because you're no longer in college,
right?
But to actually bring forth and stay true to and replicate the essence of that kind of monastic formational experience. Because I think our future of the church requires that. The church, the standard church model of formation, which I like to call is, the Sunday morning service of a TED Talk followed by a Coldplay concert. That's kind of how I think of how our church is trying to form our people. It's like, we'll just give them a great talk and then we'll give them a great concert. It's not working. It's just not working. Because our culture is so increasingly secularized, we need something far more formational, far more powerful to form our people in Jesus and to resist these tremendous forces of mammon, consumerism, technology, political polarization, and so forth. Like, there are so many strong idols in our culture. We need to form our people deeply to actually be disciples in this idolatrous age. And again, we need new models. And so I think one of the opportunities, if you are listening to this and you have been deeply formed and shaped by InterVarsity, is to ask, how do I translate that experience? You can't replicate it, again, because that model was for the college context. But how do you bring forth things like true community of deep commitment to one another versus transitory relationships that if you miss 4 Sundays in a row, nobody would actually miss you. Nobody would ever notice that on a typical Sunday. How do you actually have your gatherings be about formation and not just consuming content, right? Where you take ownership, kind of in the way that a Mark study did, where you had to own the experience. You couldn't just sit back passively and consume a Mark study. You were a participant. You were an owner of that. How do you recapture that in your current context today? So these kinds of questions of how do we form ourselves? How do we form each other? How do we let others form us? How do we take ownership of our own spiritual formation? These are questions that if you come from the InterVarsity stream, you ought to be asking yourself, how do I reclaim that legacy?
Yes, the InterVarsity was a way of being trained in following Jesus, oftentimes for many of us, radically different ways than maybe we grew up learning about, and that is not the same, as you say, can't be replicated, but can be translated to this stage of life that you are in. And what does it look like to commit to community that holds you accountable, that draws you deep into Scripture and owning that experience for yourself and for your community, that you influence one another in what it looks like to follow Jesus in these radical ways, and that has a real world impact on the context around you that Jesus has purposefully put you in for the sake of partnering with Him in this work. I think that's a really helpful frame, Curtis. Very helpful frame. As you continue on with Redeeming Babel and the other ways that Jesus is at work in your life, Curtis, how can your alumni community be praying for you?
Well, certainly pray for that I would also be doing exactly what I just described, that I would be developing my own formational communities around me. It's very dangerous, I think, to be engaged in public work in which you have attention, profile, and so forth, and not have that. And so that's I continue to be asking those questions for myself and would invite people's prayers for me on that front. Certainly this year, would appreciate people's prayers for the after party and the way that it would gain traction in the Christian world, the American Christian world, the evangelical world in particular, amidst a lot of great pressures that we're facing to give in to the partisan divides of our age.
Absolutely. We will make sure that those get put into our show notes so that anybody listening, make sure you take a look at the show notes so you can add that to your prayer list for your fellow alum here, Curtis, and to be praying for him and his colleagues and the work that they're doing. Curtis, thank you so much. You've jumped into this call in the midst. I know that you've had a whole lot of writing and revisions and things that you've been working on. You got a lot of stuff that you're doing, and so I appreciate you taking some time to share this story, to offer invitations, and to remind us that this is yet another way that one of our fellow alum is stepping into the context that Jesus has placed them in and is doing world-changing work. Curtis, you are a world changer. And so thank you. Thank you for doing this and for saying yes to Jesus and for saying yes to having this conversation. This has been fantastic.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for tuning in, alumni. Check the show notes for more information about today's guest and for ways that you could be praying for your fellow alum. If you know someone who needs to hear this story, take just a moment to share the episode with them, and then be sure to leave us a rating and a review as well. Now go change that world, alumni. Thanks for listening to InterVarsity World Changers. This podcast is brought to you by the InterVarsity Alumni Relations Team, hosted and produced by John Steele, edited by Stephen Albee, production assistance by Mike Santera, and our theme song is Crazy by InterVarsity alumnus Andy Minio.